Welcome to the Ending Sexploitation podcast, where we decode sexual harm and provide you with active solutions. I'm your host, Kaylee McNamara. All right, well, welcome back, everyone. I am joined once again by the esteemed Dani Pinter from the Nicosi Law Center. Thank you so much, Dani, for joining me again.
So happy to be here, Haley.
Today, we are talking about another Nicosi Law Center lawsuit, this time not related to a pornography platform or the online space, but actually related to the state of Nevada, which might be shocking to many people. And this is around the issue of prostitution, sex trafficking, legal brothels in Nevada. Dani, could you tell us the story of this lawsuit?
Yes, so this is Jane Doe versus Lombardo. Our client, Jane Doe, was, alleges that she was sex trafficked through the Nevada brothels, and particularly that the brothels themselves were engaging in sex trafficking activity. For example, creating conditions of debt bondage, where she'd be in these brothels working for 2 weeks straight, end up owing them money. You couldn't have a car there. You had to, they had like chain link fences around these places. They're out in the middle of nowhere. You had to pay for every little thing. You're there working, but you have to pay for the room. You have to pay for any food, but you can't bring anything with you. If you want to go on an errand, you have to use their car and pay for it. And meanwhile, they also, had all kinds of practices that were really coercive in dealing with the buyers, the Johns, that were dangerous and violent. And the brothels were facilitating all of this. And she brought this lawsuit against the brothels for this activity, but also the state of Nevada for facilitating and profiting from it, alleging knowingly, including she alleges that one of the brothel owners also was a county commissioner regulating his own brothel. So there you have the government directly involved in this very destructive and, we allege, illegal behavior, facilitating sex trafficking and even slavery under the 13th Amendment. So she brought this lawsuit as a Jane Doe, as most sex trafficking victims do, and even victims of sexual abuse and assault often use pseudonyms. And this is really a well-recognized legal principle where basically the courts and the law have understood that victims, particularly of sexual abuse and sex trafficking, those uh, those harms are so sensitive and involve such private issues that if they weren't able to proceed synonymously, they wouldn't bring the case at all, right? No matter, they've experienced such horrible things involving sexual abuse and violence that if the world is going to know that they were the victim of this activity, it's better to just keep it to themselves than seek the justice they deserve, than expose themselves and their family to the ridicule and harassment that we know comes when survivors of sexual abuse speak up. Not to mention that it's potentially life-threatening because the traffickers themselves may seek to harm them or their associates, or even the buyers at these brothels can be very dangerous. So it was almost a foregone conclusion to us that in seeking a pseudonym status, that would be granted. And shockingly, that has not been our experience.
This is such a shocking case, I think, in so many ways. And we'll definitely return to this concept of the need for a pseudonym when you're bringing this kind of case, and the fact that that's become contentious, because that's shocking in and of itself. But even just the fact of of victims coming forward talking about sex trafficking happening in legal brothels in Nevada is shocking to so many people. And to back up to the context of Nevada, as so many people know, for at least over 48 years now, probably around 50 or so, Nevada has allowed legal brothels to exist in select counties. It's not across the whole state. And this is kind of, not, this is common knowledge. People know about it. It has led to Nevada having the largest commercial sex market in the United States, which makes sense because there's increased demand for buying sex whenever it's normalized and it's permissive. And so more people travel to Nevada, go there for sex tourism, really, to come to these brothels. And there is one, and I think it's fascinating too, because very often people will say, well, prostitution, if it's regulated and it's legal and it's safe, then it will be just that. It will be safe. There will be protections. There wouldn't be any sex trafficking happening in a legal brothel because this is a situation where it's legal. And they do have state licenses, right? So that's
Yeah,
the
so I mean,
assumption.
this is
It's
yeah,
legal, so
this
it must be safe.
that's the most fascinating thing. So two things. One, because they have this legal market, it's actually resulted in an explosion of the illegal market. So, right, many of the arguments will be like, well, if you legalize it, you'll dispense with the tawdry and dangerous and exploitive illegal market. Actually, the opposite is true. For example,
Mhm.
most people think, oh, prostitution's legal in Vegas. They go to Vegas because they think they can engage in legal prostitution. That's not true. Street prostitution is still illegal, and brothels are not legal in Vegas. They allow escorting under certain circumstances, but it's not supposed to be like it. So the escorting, even the escorting regulations of Vegas say you can't engage in sexually explicit. Like it's still prostitution is still illegal, but they have escorting, but they also require STD testing. So like the whole thing is bizarre. It's only created this situation where now you have the legal infrastructure almost facilitating the illegal market. And because now they've become a tourist destination for this, their economy depended on it. But guys flying in to Vegas for a bachelor party, thinking they're going to go to a swanky brothel, only to find out that the nearest brothel is 2 hours out in the desert. They're not going to go there. So instead, they're
Mhm.
just going to do whatever is easy, whether it's an escort service or even illegal street prostitution. That's what they're going to do now, where they might not have done that in their own town. So we're seeing a
Mhm.
lot of that. And then we're also seeing what many advocates have said for a long time, which is that prostitution is inherently exploitive and that you can't legalize or regulate away the harm. So even
Mhm.
in these brothels, which are licensed, what the buyers want is very often to inflict violence against women, right? That's what they want. And they want to be able to purchase any woman they want. So you're still creating a situation where the women don't have the agency to say yes or no. And you have now the brothel standing in the place of the pimp, which is to make money. You're having to exploit these women, right? Because
Mhm.
they're now wanting to make money from these women being bought and sold. And so the women at the end of the day in these brothels are being terribly exploited, experiencing awful abuse. And we even have allegations that at times the brothels are working directly with actual pimps and traffickers. So
Wow.
it's far from safe. It's very dangerous. And if anything, it's created a capital where we also have many reports and even some of research is showing that traffickers now they go to Nevada. So they'll travel all around trafficking women and basically always making a stop at Nevada. And will even bring the women to the brothels because why not? That's a very obvious place with a demand in a market.
Yeah,
And it's
and
very
that
possible.
that demand yeah, that demand piece, it's so fascinating to see how it's not hypothetical, this idea of demand being tied to then how criminal networks respond. I mean, it makes so much sense that they would prioritize Nevada as a location where they could easily, sell and exploit people for sex. And rightly, as you said, I was going to mention there is a study about how the legal and illegal sex trade in Nevada is so intimately linked. There was a study done specifically in Nevada where they found that their sex trade, both legal and illegal, is at a minimum 63% larger than the next highest state, which is New York, and double that of Florida. And you think of New York, I mean, I don't know, in my mind, I just would imagine that the sex trade would be really the largest, I would imagine, in New
Of
York.
course.
Just the density, for so many different reasons.
International
And the fact that
travel,
Nevada,
the wealth disparity. Yeah.
yeah,
All
and
those
it's at
things.
minimum 63% higher in Nevada because of that
And
legalization, because of that open door for demand. I know there was also similar evidence from other studies about how legalized prostitution spurs the illegal sex trade in Australia, because Australia has 4 states, I think at least 4 states that have legalized prostitution. And they found that 50 to 90% of the market there operated illegally outside of the regulations, which were supposed to have, all these positive effects. But the states that legalized it, 50 to 90% of all of the sex trade was operating illegally.
Illegally. And because like the state is getting so much revenue from this, they're not even incentivized to enforce the regulations in place, right? So, we mentioned the licenses, but we allege, and we have two of these lawsuits, Williams versus Sisolak and Jane Doe versus Lombardo. So I can't remember if this allegation was in Lombardo or Sisolak case, but we have allegations from these victims that even the licensing process, they aren't following their own rules, and nobody is enforcing that because they have no incentive to do so. For example, one of the victims talks about when she went to go, the brothel actually bussed the women into the office. I think it might have been the sheriff's office where they need to get their individual licenses, and they weren't even asked for IDs.
Wow.
So there wasn't even, you have the sheriff now participating in this licensing where they're taking the brothel's word for it and not even doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is making sure, right, that the individuals have IDs, because we know that a process of controlling victims would be to take their documents, and that they are who they
Mhm.
say they are, and that they're adults even.
Mhm.
So it's just a completely
But
corrupt
even
system.
that, I mean, even just the concept of the brothel bussing them in, because I mean, this is a hypothetical. I know this isn't, but you could see someone could be in control of your documents, hand it off to you as you get
Yeah.
off of the bus, go into the sheriff's office, you walk out, they could take it as soon as you get back onto the bus. I mean, it just seems like such a weak control, a very weak system for having
And
any kind of meaningful consent verifications.
And do you think that these victims are going to feel like they can report to police when they see the police hamming it up with the brothel employees? I mean, of course
Mhm.
not, right? They don't even feel
Mhm.
like they could trust law enforcement. So yes, exactly, Haley. And then we see this playing out, in our opinion, even in the callous way the court has treated this pseudonym issue. So
Mhm.
shockingly, um, we filed this case on behalf of Jane Doe as a Jane Doe, which is extremely common. We've done this in many cases in many different jurisdictions. We're not alone. Many victims have done this. I would say the public is not even surprised to hear Jane Doe. They understand very often that victims of this kind of abuse would proceed under pseudonym. And the brothels and the defendants actually challenged that. They opposed the victim proceeding under pseudonym. And the court went along with it. That's what's so shocking. And so I
Mhm.
want to explain this. I know it's kind of difficult, but the shocking thing is the court sided with these brothel defendants who are alleged to have sex trafficked our Jane Doe, and saying, yeah, she cannot proceed as a Jane Doe. And the way that this happened is so crazy. So, um, you know, first of all, I just want to say that it's shocking that they would challenge it. And I think I want to clear something up, because I think the defendants were sort of playing up this angle that's not even accurate, which is, one, she's not a Jane Doe from the defendant. So no one is preventing this proceeding under pseudonym, does not prevent the defendants from knowing who's suing them and having every ability to
Mm.
do whatever discovery they want, do whatever they want to do to protect themselves and defend themselves. Proceeding under pseudonym does not prevent any of that. It only prevents the public from knowing who this person is, and public disclosure of maybe some intimate facts or identifying facts to protect her privacy so she can go about her life, and to prevent the defendant from being able to harass her with this
Mhm.
private information. But when the defendants, and so we know that we said, of course, we would sign a protective order providing her details to you under the terms of the protective order, right? But we want to protect her identity publicly. They said no. The defendant said the media has a right to scrutinize this victim, and that's actually a
Wow.
right they have, to have the media scrutinize her. And the judge agreed. The judge said that was a legitimate
Wow.
argument, and that if she did not hand over her identity to her alleged traffickers immediately without any protective order or protection, and go public with her name in this lawsuit, then it would be dismissed. And so she was not willing to do that, and it was dismissed.
That is so tragic, and I can't even imagine, obviously, I'm not a lawyer, but I can't even imagine any, incentive or motivation for that other than to victim blame, ostensibly, probably slut shame a woman who was being victimized in the sex trade, and so then, of course, there would be information about her being in the sex trade. And it just seems like it's the only purpose that I could see is to try to discredit her because and try to have her experience public harassment, as people might pull up past videos of her or talk about, a sex buyer could talk about abusing her and in the public eye, and just to make like a mockery of a person who's been abused. I just don't see any legitimate reason, especially because I'm really glad that you cleared that up about they as defendants would have access to the information. They would be able to do the discovery that they need. The only thing is for it to be public. That's just so crazy.
Exactly, Haley, because that was even the argument, right? It's their argument was, why would your argument, you're a defendant and you have every right to defend yourself, and you probably will try to discredit her through the course of the case, and that's your right. But they're asking for the public to be able to discredit her. I mean, that's so improper in my opinion. It was so
Yeah.
inappropriate to even make that argument, and absolutely shocking that a federal judge would agree with it. Truly shocking and outrageous, because especially at this time where we've seen this happen so many times, where we see the victims get completely harassed and trashed in the media, and the harm that caused. Who would want to come forward, and why would you? It wouldn't be worth it if that's what you're up against, which she knows she's likely still potentially going to face that. There's no guarantee that at trial she would retain her pseudonym status. They're going to try and do this anyway, but for the court to sanction that as an option, this public humiliation ritual, what does that have to do with the law? What does that have to do with
Yeah. That has
litigation? Why does the media have anything to do with it? It's really insane, and disturbing. And so, just want to clarify, we are appealing that decision. The case was
mm,
dismissed for that reason. We're absolutely appealing it because we think that jeopardizes the rights of victims everywhere, and is a
yes.
horrific legal precedent. And so we're very much hoping to get a different result at the appeals court.
I really hope that you guys do, because I mean, it even just makes me think about, people that I know who experienced a sexual assault. And for any survivor, they think about, do I want to go into the court system? Is it worth it? For so many, this is a question that they have about how it will impact their life, not only the re-traumatization of going through a court system, having to relive that, having to have, some degree of confrontation with the person who abused you, but also that fear of it becoming your identity is that's just and then to imagine someone who has been experienced sexual violence repeatedly, because that is what prostitution and sex trafficking is that it's systematic and recurring sexual violence, which is so traumatic on not only physical levels but also for mental health. I just can't imagine um, someone having to make that decision of, do you seek justice but risk everything in your life becoming open to the public? I just think that that's so terrible.
Especially to, I mean, the court is supposed to weigh a variety of factors. We don't believe the court even did that appropriately. But even in exercising the court's discretion to consider the power dynamics of this situation, because that's what the court is tasked with doing, considering the factors of these parties. You have an
Mm,
individual with no money who has pro bono representation of a nonprofit against one of the most powerful individuals in the state with endless money, truly multi-million, if not billionaire, and these brothels with money. And they're actually saying the media has a right to inquire. Yet I would hope that the calculation there is they're going to hire a PR machine to quite
mhm,
intentionally spend money to sick the media and place stories, and they don't, and the court can't regulate that, right? That's beyond the court's control to a certain degree. If that stuff's even accurate, if it's even true, how can the court can't sit there and control until it's too late? It's like, once they've done if they've done really egregious things, okay, then the victim could bring that maybe to the court. But is the remedy even going to make her whole at that point? The damage is done, right? So, I mean,
mhm.
it's so insane for the court to sort of take the side of very, very wealthy alleged sex traffickers, right to what spend their money to publicly shame and harass this victim for bringing a lawsuit. I also feel like that's such a
Mhm.
violation of our First Amendment rights, which is the
Right.
exact reason for the pseudonym is to encourage public participation, to recognize that without pseudonym status, you will have a chill of speech. You will not participate
Mhm.
in what is
Yeah.
rightful and just to seek accountability for some grave harms done to you. And particularly because she had constitutional claims. She brought 13th Amendment anti slavery claims, and to say that she could not proceed without putting everything on the line against these very powerful opponents is, to me, is just like intentionally chilling her speech and her
Yes.
participation in a shocking way.
And, I have to just personally wonder how much even this framing of prostitution in these brothels being legal, and I just wonder how much even just that framing might have led into this decision. It
Yeah.
might have led into this concept of, well, people who are there are not perfect victims. They're people who have experienced, maybe participated in different ways in victimization. I just think in so many ways, when you frame this as a safe and beneficial thing, do you know what I mean? I don't think I'm
Yeah,
explaining
I
it very
think
well, but
well,
it's like
and
the framing of it, I think, can, like, insidiously get into some of the assumptions that maybe a judge or a jury, I'd have certainly concerns about a jury would bring into it that, well, are you just being dramatic because you didn't like the scenario? Meanwhile, there's barbed wires and debt bondage and sexual violence happening in these rooms. But do you know what I mean? I don't think I'm coming with the right
precisely.
words, but
No, I think you're hitting on something so insightfully, Haley, because when it's legal prostitution and we're alleging sex trafficking and sexual assault, but in this context of legal system, I am only speculating. We don't really know what the court is thinking, but
Mhm.
this becomes perhaps an employment dispute instead, right? So
Right.
instead of framing this of what horrible sexual abuse and violence this person has experienced, you're thinking disgruntled employee.
Mhm.
Certainly, that is going to change how you look at this victim, how you treat the sensitivity of the issues, which are exactly what goes into, pseudonym status, for example, and myriad. And this theme will continue. Is she going to be treated like a victim of sexual abuse and sex trafficking, which she is, or is she going to be treated as like a disgruntled employee?
Mm,
Because
mhm,
those are vastly different claims, and the sensitivity of the issues, there couldn't be a wider ocean. And is she not
mhm.
going to ever get the care that, we fought so hard for the legal system to acknowledge that victims of sexual abuse and sex trafficking deserve to have in the legal system? So I think
Yes.
that's
That
exactly
it
right.
that it is a unique, section of law for a reason, because of unique harms, because of unique protections that are needed for the survivors. I think too, even just broadly, I'm glad that we're talking about this, and I think we should do another episode around the Nevada cases again in the near future, just because I think people are so shocked. I just don't want to run past what the case includes and what those elements include of coercion. And because very often when Nkosi is talking about sex trafficking, obviously sex trafficking is the exchange, any kind of sexual encounter in exchange for money or goods of any kind, force, fraud, coercion. If someone's under the age of 18, debt bondage is included in that definition. But people just think very often of cases like this. The picture that people have in their minds of sex trafficking is someone physically isolated and trapped with barbed wire around them, and not being able to leave physically. And so often we're talking about cases that are maybe more nuanced, where there's an online element, or the fact that children could even be sex trafficked even while they're in their own hometown, and you don't have to be moved across state lines in order to be sex trafficked. But this is just such a classical picture of sex trafficking, and the fact that it's happening in these legal establishments and that no one's talking about it is just crazy. Like, this should just be
Yeah.
headline news, and I'm hoping that it will be soon and that we can make it headline news. I'm hoping that everyone who's listening to this can help by speaking out more about it, because it's just such a clear picture of sex trafficking that's happening in these places. And you said that this case really brings in the 13th Amendment and talks about slavery being related to these. Could you just explain a little bit about what that argument is?
Well, I will try. My colleague Kristen Price is really the expert on that, and we should do a whole episode on these cases, and particularly so she can break this down. But the 13th Amendment was passed after slavery in the Reformation era, where Reconstruction era, where the South was still resisting the reality that slavery was illegal, and so they were trying to implement slavery in other ways by either really oppressive fraud statutes was like kind of the classic where um, a farmer, right? So you'd have these slave over farmers now being able to basically re-enslave the African Americans working on their farms by, saying it was like employment contracts, really horrific employment contracts or debt bondage or fraud, and saying basically creating these conditions where there was no way that the individual wouldn't ultimately be in debt to the farmer, and then the farmer could force them to work without pay and control their
Mhm.
lives, right? And treat them exactly like they did as slaves, but legally because they were employed, right? And so through this employment relationship, they could, or through this debt bondage relationship, they could make slavery in a legal way, in a technically legal way, and ultimately those were challenged up to the court, and the Supreme Court said no, you can't, even though these are laws on the books, if in the end they're really creating conditions of slavery, this is not permitted. And that's what under the 13th Amendment, which made slavery illegal. And so that is what we're arguing is happening in Nevada, where you have a legal system, but
Mhm.
all of the elements of the way, both the systematic and way it is created under the law, and the way that the systems maybe ignore the law or implement the law or what disregard the law, both, because it's interesting because there will be laws that there has to be a fence around the brothel, and so they'll say, well, that's why we have the barbed wire, because there has to be a fence. And it's like, well, what are the reasons that there has to be a fence in the first place, right? Like, some of the regulations themselves seem to create these conditions of slavery. Some of the ways in
Mhm.
which the law are systematically disregarded seem to create the conditions of slavery. All of these things add up to a legal system that in the end the individuals involved are de facto being sex trafficked, right, or experiencing indentured servitude and slavery. And so that's where we say the state of Nevada, through its legal regime, is violating the 13th Amendment by maybe facially neutral laws that in the end are resulting in slavery, and that is the intention and that is the practice.
Mhm. So what are the next steps on this? You're appealing. Is there anything that you would say the public could do to support or just raise awareness around this issue?
Yeah, so we're appealing in one of the cases, we're appealing that 13th Amendment issue because although we were able to proceed in our case against the brothels, the court said they did not file violations of the 13th Amendment. But for all the reasons we stated, we think that that was wrong and we want to appeal that. So we're appealing that, and then we're also appealing the pseudonym issue in the other case. So please come read about our cases, share with us if you have relevant information. If you are a nonprofit or an organization working in this anti-trafficking space, please get in touch with us if you want to join us in our advocacy on this issue, because this is particularly the pseudonym issue. We want to engage the whole anti-trafficking community to come around us, raise awareness about this issue, support us. We'll find different ways that you can, and to notify the public. This is not a decision we can let stand and can't let slip by in the night. We need to call attention to it and need to squash it immediately, because it could jeopardize survivors everywhere. I really believe that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dani, for all of your work and the work of Kristen and others on the Law Center on this issue. We'll include some of those links in the show notes. Thank you, everyone, so much for being part of the solutions here when we're tackling hard issues. And please just continue to subscribe, like, share, and thank you so much for joining us in ending sexploitation.